equality and were to implement the mandate in favor of the majority of the population in Palestine, they would have to renounce what? The Balfour Declaration. And that's something Great Britain was not about to do. And after World War II, it basically fell to a second-tier nation, and they pretty much gave up Palestine. Here you go, newly formed United Nations. Handle this mess that we just created. Figure it out. Here's the things that we did in the past 20 years. We're forwarding all of that to you. They just forwarded the emails of all the different documents and said, here you go. Here's our commission reports from 1920, 21, 29, 33, 36. Here's what took place on the ground. Here's what's happening right now. Solve it. Okay. So the United Nations set up a committee. United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, famously known as UNESCO. And after some deliberation, there was a majority position and a minority position that eventually came about. Now remember, we're talking about a baby United Nations, 40-something countries or something like that, not 195 that we have today. So it was a baby United Nations. And of course, you had the Security Council that had this 5 permanent members. So here's the position that UNESCO came up with. They said, okay, majority of us agree on the following: terminating the mandate, partitioning Palestine, create an Arab state. Notice they didn't call it Palestinian state. Arab state, Jewish state, and in Latin, concept known as corpus separatum for Jerusalem. I'll just spend 2 minutes on that in a second to go over that, which would come under the special international regime that would be administered by the United Nations. The minority position is terminate the mandate, establish a federal state consisting of both Arab and Jewish state with Jerusalem as the capital. This concept of corpus separatum, basically, this is Latin for separate entity. So Jerusalem is a unique place in the world. It's home to the 3 monotheistic expressions. It should not be run by a particular government or a particular ruler. It should be internationalized. It should be for everybody, right? And this is the status of Jerusalem today, by the way. Remember the infamous Trump declaration? And the world pretty much went against him. Even Western allied powers, Western powers went against him as well because of this very special status for Jerusalem. Notice, it doesn't say East Jerusalem, it doesn't say West Jerusalem, it says Jerusalem. So that's the status of Jerusalem. So under international law, believe it or not, Israel is not the sovereign in any inch of Jerusalem, east or west. We're talking about even West Jerusalem. Israel does not have sovereignty over that land. It has de facto control. And there's a difference between de facto and de jure control. De facto is by fact, de jure is by law. So Israel has what is called the internationally recognized borders. West Jerusalem would be considered under its de facto control. The other areas would be under its de jure control. So didn't mean to add a little bit of confusion there, but just to flush out what this concept means of corpus separatum. So that's the UN position. The Arab leadership, do you know what they did? They said, wait a minute. I want the most esteemed international legal body in the world to determine whether you, United Nations, have the competence to recommend such a partition. Who are you? How do you have the right? Just because you took the place of the League of Nations? So I want the ICJ to render an opinion. Guess who vehemently opposed that? The Zionist movement. Why? Because they knew that if the law was applied, the law would not favor them. They needed politics to win over the law. They needed the powers that be to embrace their ideology and their agenda over any type of rule of law. So the ICJ did not render an advisory opinion on this. And eventually the UN passed what is known as the partition plan. That little pink area in the middle, that's the Corpus Separatum, that's Jerusalem. The area in orange would go to the Arab state. The area in light blue would go to the Jewish state. Now there's a small little area here, okay, known as the Jaffa Enclave. You see the word Jaffa? That went to the Arab state. Why? Does anybody know why that went to the Arab state and not the Jewish state? It looks weird. Why would that be part of the Arab state? It's not attached. It's just this small little enclave, and it's going to the Arab state. It was not part of the Jewish state under the UN partition plan. Go ahead. Well, that was a British concern back in the day, but now that the British gave up Palestine, so that political consideration is not something that the UN took account of during this period.
Are you talking about the blue that's up above?
Correct.
Syria,
Right under Tel Aviv. Right under Tel Aviv. Jaffa. The Jewish population in Palestine was still only 1/3 of the population of the whole area. Even with all of the legal, so-called legal and illegal immigration into Palestine. Even with all of that, still only 1/3 of the population. And still only owned about 6.2% of the land. So 70,000 Palestinian Arabs lived in the Jaffa Enclave. The United Nations didn't want to look stupid and give the Jewish state an area where they are not the majority. Because if they took out Jaffa and said that's also part of the Jewish state, you're not the majority in your own state. How can we call it a Jewish state? Doesn't make demographic sense. So the Jaffa Enclave, okay, that's 70,000 Palestinian Arabs. Okay, they become part of the Arab state. Now you're a bare majority. You just made it. 50.9%, almost 51%. Boom. Now you're the Jewish state. So, but the unfairness, the fundamental unfairness, the fundamental injustice of this proposition will be laid out right now. Okay. Now we're going to put aside the moral argument, whether the UN even had the right to do this, whether partition was morally justified. Let's assume that it was. Okay? We all know that it's not. We all know that the Palestinian leadership, the countries had every right to oppose the UN partition plan. From every angle you look at it, they had every right to. But let's suppose that it was a justifiable proposition. Now we're going to tackle the merits of the proposition. So now during this point of the discussion, we're assuming that it's justified to partition Palestine. Okay? Let's just assume that it's justified. Okay, well the division has to be fair then. If dividing it is justified, well at least you got to divide it in a fair way. All right, here we go. Oh, wait a minute. The majority of the land goes to 1/3 of the population? Whoa. The fair split would have been 2/3 of the land goes to 2/3 of the population, and 1/3 goes to 1/3. It makes mathematical sense, right? But no, that wasn't the case here. Of the total amount of villages, at least half fell within the proposed Jewish state. They were only 1/3 of the total population. Let's take a look at population. I'm calling it the Palestinian state, but the UN referred to it as the Arab state. So that would have 818,000 Palestinians. But this includes, like I said, 71,000 Palestinians of the Jaffa enclave, right? And it would have less than 10,000 Jews. That's clearly in the Arab state, right? Population-wise, no doubt about it, but not the Jewish state, which was a bare majority. Now let's take a look at the divisions within Palestine. So in southern Palestine, the Jews number 1,020, and the Palestinians 103,000. And that went to the Jewish state. Northern Palestine, in the eastern Galilee, Palestinian population is 3 times greater than the Jewish population. That went to the Jewish state. Only in the central sector, the coastal plain between the Tel Aviv and Haifa and the inner plain southeast of Haifa, do the Jews constitute a majority. But out of the total Jewish population in the section, which is 304,000, or almost 65%, they lived in a few areas only, Haifa and Tel Aviv. So in fact, the Jews are a minority in the countryside of this sector where they make up the majority. So if you were to break it down and put more colors on that partition map in terms of the population layout, it would the map would seem laughable, the partition plan. Land ownership. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I rounded a percent up. It was about 6.2%. Let's call it 7%. Okay, so they owned 1.8 million dunams. This was after decades of land conquest and possessions and buying and all of that. Out of the 26 million dunams that exist, this is how much the Jewish ownership was. And look at the second point here, the second bullet point. They owned what? 11% in where? In the Jewish state. So the proposed Jewish state, the Jewish bare majority, own only 11% of the land. This is the equitable split that the United Nations made. And 80% of that land is owned by, of the cultivable land is owned by Palestinians. Now, talked about land size, we talked about population mass. Now we talk about land quality. The fertile coastal plains and all the interior plains went to the Jewish state. Citrus and cereal producing areas went to the Jewish state. 40% of Palestinian industry and electrical supplies fell within the Jewish state. The majority of the riverine water supply went to the Jewish state. The whole of Lake Tiberias and its rich fishing industry went to the Jewish state. The only airport in the country with international connections went to the Jewish state. So even if partition was justified, the partitioning of it on its merits was unfair, fundamentally unjust, fundamentally unequal. And on that basis, the Palestinians had every right to reject it, even if the concept of partition was justified. You guys understand the distinction that I'm making? I'm not making the moral argument about whether partitioning is justified or not. We went past that. Now we're talking about partitioning itself. So, in this baby United Nations, did you know that they did not even get a majority? Their 2/3 majority that was actually required. The Zionist movement, and with the help of the United States a little bit, pressured countries vote this way, and even bribed countries to vote a certain way. So a straw vote was taken. And these 6 countries were pressured to change their vote so that this baby United Nations can get its 2/3 majority. Whenever you hear the concept, the world, be careful. You know, the world believes, what do you mean? You know, the US is not the world. The West is not the world. So we just got to be careful when we say the international community. Who are you talking about? What does the world mean? Obviously, the world existed. The size of the world was the same back then as it is today, but the United Nations was not. It did not have all these African countries as part of the United Nations. It did not have all the Asian countries as part of the United Nations. So there's a lot of nations that are not part of this equation. So the world didn't think partition was justified. The members of the United Nations General Assembly in November of 1947 voted this way. And not even the people of those countries, but the leaders of those countries. And even in the beginning, they did not have the 2/3 majority required to pass this resolution. But only after pressure was applied on these 6 countries did they finally get their 2/3 majority. Okay. So now we get to the nitty-gritty here. There's 2 concepts here. They refer to generally the same period, at least the beginning portions of it, the first 2 years. A Nakba versus the War of Independence. Why am I laying it out this way? Because we need to have the proper framing. When we discuss Palestine, when we discuss the Palestinian people, when we discuss the rights of the Palestinian people, we have to frame it from within the lens of the oppressed. We have to frame it from within the lens of those that are actually fighting for liberation. And we need to see why the framing matters. War of Independence, when you hear that, what comes to mind? When you hear War of Independence? You know, the Algerians versus the French. It's a war of independence. That's what comes to mind. An oppressed fighting against an oppressor. A suppressed fighting against their suppressor. Colonized fighting against the colonizer. Right? So that's how this framing actually plays out when you talk about the period of 1948. But when you hear a Nakba, catastrophe, but you're talking about the same period. How can both of these coexist? How can you have a war of independence and still have a Nakba? It's about framing. Who's telling the story? Whose narrative are you listening to? So what the Zionist movement did in a clever way is turn history on its head. We, the colonizer, are fighting a war of independence against the colonized subjects. Well, we can't say it like that. We, the Jews, this is our land. These Arabs, in the last 2,000 years, invaded our land, and the British is now against us. The world is against us. We had the Holocaust that just happened. We've suffered pogroms and discrimination. We are the victims in this narrative. And we're fighting to be free against the oppressive forces against us. Can they really emphasize who that oppressive force is? No. But the framing works. You know? It can stick to the average person. So that's why it's important for us to frame it in the proper way from within the lens of the oppressed. So a Nakba is the proper framing. Catastrophe. Okay. So now we're talking about a specific period of time. Where are we now in the time frame? November 1947, partition plan. The Nakba began when? Israel declared statehood in May of 1948. So now we have this 6-month period where things happen. Okay? So you have sort of independent Arab states, Transjordan being one of them. Emir Abdullah eventually became King Abdullah under the thumb of the British Empire. And now there's a book that I want you to read, written by Israeli historian Avi Shleim. It's called Collusion Across the Jordan. It's a great book that really outlines the inner workings of the British, the Hashemite kingdom, and the Zionist movement, and how they had a tacit agreement that Transjordan, and notice, Transjordan had the most formidable Arab army at the time. And there was an agreement that they would not touch 1 inch of the proposed Jewish state under the United Nations partition plan. So Zionist movement knew that. So we're going to see who the David is and who the Goliath is in a moment. Okay? So that was still under the thumb of the British as well, but there was less direct control than there was in Jordan. Okay, because remember, Egypt technically, received its independence, quote unquote, in the 20s, but really it was in 1952, and Jamal Abdel Nasser's takeover, and that's when Egypt eventually became independent. But that's a good point. Ghalib Pasha, who was essentially the commander of the Arab Legion, Britain, commander of the Arab Legion. So he had his thumb on the British Empire. So the motives behind this arrangement was not to lead the Transjordanian forces into battle, but what? To restrain them and to achieve an accord with the Haganah, who eventually became the IDF. So, hey, I'm Ghalib Pasha. I'm the commander of this legion. I'm just here to make sure that you're not crossing into that line there. Your goal is to expand your kingdom. Okay, you're our friend, you're our ally. We'll let you expand your kingdom, but only in that proposed Arab state under the partition plan. You don't go anywhere near the Jewish state. Correct. All right. So we already had that arrangement. Here are the militias that we were just talking about. So these are the Zionist militias and regular army. The Irgun, the Lehi, and the Haganah, which is the regular army. Eventually, after 1948, they coalesced and became the IDF, or what we know today as the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces. But that's generally how this all played out. So, here we go. From December of 1947, all the way up until May of 1948, there was a war. See, when we think of and I remember when Benjamin Netanyahu came to the White House when Obama was president and said to Obama's face, I mean, he made a statement, Benjamin Netanyahu, that was the exact opposite of what happened. Like it was like a 180 lie. What he said was the Arab invasion into Israel, 5 Arab armies, powerful Goliath, right? They invaded the newly founded baby. We're just a fetus. We're just a baby state. We were just born into existence. We're tiny. We could have been eliminated, eradicated, genocided, whatever it is, right? And that invasion caused the Arab refugee crisis. So it is the Arab states who are responsible for the refugee crisis. The exact opposite happened. It was the refugee crisis that caused the Arab invasion. The exact reverse. When we talk about Nakba refugees, we talk about this period, 47 to 49. How many Palestinians were made refugees in this period? Everybody should know this. 750, 800, okay, somewhere between 700 and 800,000. Okay? Half of that was during this period. So before Israel said we are a state, there was already 350,000 Palestinian refugees. The other 350, 400 came after May of 1948. The Arab countries saw the refugees coming in. You know how we have a newly formed United Nations? We also had a newly formed so-called Arab League that coordinated, whatever, if you want to call it coordination. They coordinated, and who was the nominal leader of the Arab armies? No. King Abdullah of Transjordan. And who was the leader of the Arab Legion? Gulab Pasha. So the leader of the Arab armies was a man who was working under the thumb of the British Empire. And you want us to go to war and win? No, I mean, I'm sorry that I'm putting it this way, but this narrative that we hear today, baby Jewish state against 5 huge Arab armies, we were about to be annihilated, driven into the sea, this whole victimhood narrative. And when you study the history in depth and you analyze the balance of forces, you come away with the conclusion like, what are you talking about? I mean, even if it was somewhat close, you can, okay, if the argument is somewhat close, I would make it. I would say, oh, okay, you know, it's a colorable statement. It can be true, it may be true. It's a toss-up. This is not even close. It was a civil war between the Jews and Palestinian Arabs. So you have a well-organized military force versus a disunited Palestinian group of irregular forces, not regular forces, irregular forces, and then later what is called the ALA, the Arab Liberation Army, a volunteer force. So they're not regulated by any kind of military framework. They don't know the proper ins and outs of fighting, and they didn't have the proper ammunition. This was the balance of forces during this period. Who's David and who's Goliath? Just in terms of forces. Forget intelligence, forget armament, forget ability, history of fighting, talking about militias that fought in World War II, and etc. So in every facet of warfare, on one side you had a Goliath. But what is pervaded in our media? The exact opposite. They present, because sometimes quantity can be perceived as quality. And the layperson, someone who doesn't understand the ins and outs of what actually took place, can buy into that. If I told you a state that was just founded against 5 surrounding states and they go to war without any more context, the average person may say, oh, that's not a fair fight. That's 1 against 5. They're bound to lose that. But that's quantity over quality. Now we're talking about forces. We didn't get to May yet. We're still in this 5-6 month period. Refugee crisis is being created right now. So, all the while, the propaganda is, we're going to be driven into the sea. They're going to attack us. The Arab armies are going to attack us. But what did the Zionist movement do when Great Britain announced that it was going to leave? Thank God. Even though they didn't believe in God, the founding fathers. But leave. But wait a minute. I thought you were afraid to be driven into the sea. I thought you were the victim. I thought you were about to be annihilated. You don't want the British Empire to remain to protect you? Or maybe it's not true. And you are the Goliath. And you want this other nation to leave so that you can impose your will against the David. That's what was really taking place. So the Zionist movement formulated a plan known as Plan D, Plan Dalet. There were 3 other plans: Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. I'm not going to get into those, but they were they were not the master plan. This is what people call the master plan for the takeover of all of Palestine and for the expulsion of the Palestinians. So there were various phases during this period. Okay, let me get into. Sorry, I'm getting a little sweaty here. It's exciting stuff. Just because I know that we are dispelling a lot of myths as we're going over this. Okay. So this master plan was to take over strategic areas and remove the populations from within those areas. Okay. This played a critical role in the mass expulsion of the Palestinians, the Deir Yassin massacre. This happened when? I forgot to put the date on there. When in 1940? After Israel established its state?
August, maybe? I'm guessing, I don't know.
If-
May,
Before
June,
May.
July.
April 9th,
Still
19,
in that 6 months.
1948. This is before any single Arab nation invaded or entered Palestine. I shouldn't say invaded, entered Palestine. So it was committed by the so-called dissidents, those two other militias, the Irgun and Lehi. Now this tends to exonerate David Ben-Gurion's Haganah. He was the leader of the regular army. But what did David Ben-Gurion do?
Good job, guys.
Not only that, we're going to send you our elite fighting force, the Palmach, and they will come to Deir Yassin and make sure that the job is finished. So Haganah was actually very heavily involved in this, but they tried to absolve themselves to not take primary blame. And I talked with a couple of historians on this because when I was reading the literature, the Zionist propaganda said 250 were killed. By the way, it was a little over 100, and there was rapes and mutilation and I mean, you name it. The things that they talk about happened to Jews in Israel. That's exactly what happened in Deir Yassin. Okay, the things that they would condemn if it's done to Jewish persons, but when it comes to Palestinians, they just want to gloss over it. Okay, but there's a reason why Zionist propaganda inflated the numbers. Why do you think that reason is? To instill flight and fright. Hey, look what happened here at this village. You don't want that to happen to you? Leave before it does happen to you. We already took Jaffa. We already took Tiberias. We already took Haifa. By the way, these places were taken throughout this 5-6 month period. And we already have a refugee crisis. We already have Palestinians being ethnically cleansed as we go through this period. Okay. Now we get into May 15th. Okay. Between May 14th and May 15th, 3 things happened. I should say 4 things. No, 3 things happened. Israel declared statehood. The British took every last one of its personnel out of Palestine. So it was at this point the evacuation of the British was complete. Israel declares statehood. The British leave Palestine. The Arab armies enter Palestine. So this all happens within a 24-hour span between May 14th and May 15th. Uh-oh, they're going to be driven into the sea, right? Well, let's take a look at the balance of powers, shall we? Okay. The Egyptian army had the most personnel. Even this one is slightly contested. If you read Walid Khalidi's book, his writings, and you read Salman Abu Sitta's writings, some say that the British forces were actually less than this, probably less than 3,000. It's not. I mean, there's differing sources on that. I don't know how they do the count, but I'm using an Israeli source here, so I'm trying to inflate the numbers as much as possible. Okay. All right. So this is what you have. Now remember, the Arab Legion did not enter any inch of the proposed Jewish state. Okay? Let's keep that in mind. Okay. So of the overall force prepared by the Arab League, the total was about 23,500 men. And you can actually subtract from that 4,500 because those and the best fighting unit the Arab Legion, because they did not enter the proposed Jewish state. Okay, so really it was 4 Arab armies that entered the newly founded Jewish state. You guys following? Okay. What's that? Did you say 3 countries? 4? No, 4. Jordan was the one that I'm excluding. Now you have Syria, Lebanon, you have Iraq, and you have Egypt. Okay, so now we get to the rounds of fighting. The main clash between the Arab Legion and the IDF was outside the area allotted to the Jewish state, in and around Jerusalem. King Abdullah and Jordan, they wanted to make sure that they captured the holy places, and they annexed that into their kingdom. And after heavy fighting, they were able to do that, and they were able to capture that. But there was a general agreement: you're going to stop fighting now. You did what you needed to do. Let us go finish the job in other parts. There were various truces throughout this period, and I want to get into them. So now we're in May. June, the first truce. Fighting stops. The British, they lead in this call for a ceasefire, and they try to put pressure on the Arab League to accept it. Guess who imposed an arms embargo? The United States. The U.S. imposed an arms on everyone, including Israel. That was a different United States. If that, I mean, by the way, there are many Zionists that view Harry Truman as not a friend, basically, for that. And the U.S. embargo was imposed in 1947-48, and it was kept in force until the end of the war in 1949. Great Britain placed a complete embargo on the supply of military material to Palestine and all the Arab countries, despite the fact that the embargo involved suspending obligations that arose between Egypt, Iraq, and Transjordan. There were treaties between these countries. These 3 countries, Egypt, Iraq, and Transjordan, Britain was the only source of military equipment. So add that to the David and Goliath analysis. Now with this complete embargo. Israel imported vast quantities of military hardware. In addition to all the hardware it stole from Great Britain while it was in Palestine, they primarily received it from the Eastern Bloc, primarily Czechoslovakia, which was in contravention of this UN decreed ceasefire. So as a result of that, the Arab armies continued to fight. And then there was a second truce in July. And Great Britain again pressured the Arab states to acquiesce. And the hostilities renewed again in October. Now we get to August. There was a meeting between the Iraqi ministers and King Abdullah. This was in the first weeks of August, the first few weeks of August. And the topic was withdrawing British troops and placing the 2 Hashemite armies. Iraq was the Hashemite regime under Faisal. Transjordan was the Hashemite regime under King Abdullah. They're brothers. They're brothers. Great Britain pretty much told them, all right, fine. France kicked you out of Syria. Faisal, come here. We'll put you over here in Iraq. And Abdullah's like, all right, you don't have your father. We promised him the Arab kingdom. He didn't get it. All right, well, you can have this area here called Transjordan. All right, here you go. But you're going to be under our thumb, right? Okay, cool. All right. So they came together and they said, let's place the 2 Hashemite armies under a unified command. But something happened. Abdullah lost interest when it turned out that Iraq couldn't help financially, and of course they cared about their financial well-being as well. So that ended up not going through. And then there was a proposed inclusion of the Galilee to the Jewish state, so that the King Abdullah can have the Negev, the Naqab. Why? Because Great Britain treated that was in Great Britain's strategic interest. So we'll help you, Abdullah, get this. But the Iraqis were fighting in central Palestine. We don't have an interest there, and we're not going to help you. So you can go ahead and lose that battle. So at the end, why am I bringing this up? Because the British involvement in this was solely for its own interests. What can we do to maintain our interests in the region and maintain these powers that are under our thumb and keep them happy? I don't care what happens to Palestine. I don't care what happens to the native population. I don't care. And guess what? I'm okay to feel that way. You know why? Because they don't care. The regimes that are under my thumb, they're not expressing interest. They don't care what's about to take place. Okay, so Great Britain's plan was to add the Negev to Transjordan, but eventually the Americans shot that down, and of course the Arab leaders wanted to shoot that down as well. Now we reach mid-October. Israel launches an attack in contravention of the truce against Egyptian forces, pushes them all the way back, and they even entered El Arish. And under U.S. and British pressure, they had to leave. Now we're talking about a fighting force that was growing in numbers. Okay, so the Goliath was growing, and the David was diminishing. There were already David and Goliath, but now the Goliath is getting even bigger, and the David is getting even smaller. And when Menachem Begin and other Zionist leaders say a miraculous victory, there was nothing. It would have been miraculous if the Arab armies had won. That would have been miraculous. But it was known. The balance of forces, the intelligence, the armaments, all of that was on Israel's side. Okay, now we reach the end of November. Israel was able to fulfill most of its goals and has driven east, driven north. Now, the 55% that was allotted to them in 1947, now Israel was able to capture 78% of the whole of Palestine. And, I forgot to include the map here, but we know those 4 maps. We would be entering the second map now. That's when you have the West Bank. Now you have a shrunken version of Gaza. January 1947, the UN decreed a ceasefire. And then in 1949, the surrounding Arab states agreed to armistice agreements, which basically is the same thing as the Green Line. The Green Line is the line that separates what is the internationally recognized borders of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. These lines eventually were shattered to pieces in June of 1967 when Israel captured the whole of Palestine. So in 1949, and by the way, there's a very interesting period in between 48 and 49. Once Israel was able to capture more territory and then achieve these armistice agreements, it made sure to implement right away laws, because now it became a state. And in order, by the way, Israel was not a member of the UN at this time. They had to do what to become members of the United Nations? They had to know. They were a state. They were recognized, but they were not members of the UN because they had to do what? They had to accept the UN Charter and all of the UN resolutions that were in place at the time. And what were those resolutions? Resolution 181, which is the partition resolution, and Resolution 194, the right of the refugees to return to their homes. So Israel actually accepted Resolution 194. But the moment that it accepted it and became a member state of the UN, change our minds. Take us out of the UN, try it. And then, so through trickery. If I was a member of the Security Council, I would have said, all right, let's implement the right of return. Then you could become a member state of the UN, but that's not how it happened. They entrusted Israel to actually implement it. And of the 750,000 Palestinians that were dispossessed, ethnically cleansed from their homes, 200,000 of that number went to Gaza. And that number is now 1.5, 1.6 million. And a lot of them have been killed over the last year plus. Refugees from 1948, that a lot of whom can see their homes from their rooftops, whichever rooftops still remain. Can see their vacant homes, some of them vacant. So, and this is the most conservative assessment here. Of the 418 depopulated villages, approximately 70% were totally destroyed and 90% was largely destroyed, aside from the population changing overnight. And it was at that time that Israel was able to consolidate its gains and impose martial law on the Palestinians that remained in the newly founded state, which is about 160,000. And that number is now 1.2, 1.3 million. And the Palestinians have been scattered since, and we all know what's taking place right now. But if you don't understand this period, the last 5 weeks, you can't really talk about Gaza today. When you talk about refugees of Gaza, they went through 76 years of history. You can't just talk about just the last year. You can't talk about one date. You have to talk about a lot of dates. And we have to put it in the right context. So, all right. I'll stop here. I'll drink my coffee while you guys ask me some questions.
How did they give them authority to start the massacre? Like, who gave them authority?
Who gave the Zionists themselves? They have their own leadership command. There were leaders of the Irgun, leaders of the Lehi, leaders of the Haganah. Ben Gurion led the Haganah, Yitzhak Shamir led the Lehi, and Menachem Begin led the Irgun. And all three eventually became prime ministers. One was the first one, and then the others very, very prominent and well known. If you don't know Menachem Begin, he's the one that shook hands with Anwar Sadat. If you don't know Yitzhak Shamir, he was the leader after the first Intifada. So he wasn't a leader like 10 years later. I'm talking like 30 years later. Yeah. Yeah, no, not this time. 80, yeah. I think it was 81.
When that embargo was placed on the arms.
December 1947, yeah. It was released right after the war, January of 1949.
So then, were they able to get more weapons after that was uplifted?
Oh yeah. Slowly but surely, Israel was able to arm itself more. But the special relationship that exists between the U.S. and Israel that began post 1967, and that's where the weapons, diplomatic aid, military. That's when it really skyrocketed, basically. But it was still receiving its weapons from the Eastern Bloc.
Did you say that before this event in 1967 that the U.S.
67?
I misspoke there, but yeah. Point is, like, before this happened, like before the U.S. decided to become like a full ally, not like full bipartisan ally of Israel. Could you say that before that, the U.S.'s relationship with Israel was a partisan issue, or not really?
No, it was not. By the way, presidents like to say this a lot. Obama said it a few times, which kind of irked me. Our relationship is so special. It's so sacrosanct. That's why it only took the U.S. 11 minutes after Israel established its state for us to recognize Israel. It only took us 11 minutes. They love to tout that, but in fact, that was in contravention of what the State Department believed and what the Defense Department. There was internal, heat that Truman thought that by supporting Israel's creation, it would help him in his elections. So it was a partisan move on his part. The State Department said, "Don't do it." But now, that's not the climate that you see in the U.S. Back then, there was beef between the State Department and the president. State Department cared about the United States. They still had kind of an isolationist mindset. Truman just cared about his reelection. So he's like, if I have to support Israel's creation, I'm going to do it if it's going to help my votes. So that's basically why. But he did it de facto. The de jure one came a year or so later. The first country actually in the world to recognize Israel de jure by law was actually the Soviet Union. That was the first country. People say U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel. It was the first de facto country. Oh, we'll say it. Okay, fine. We support you. We support your existence. But by law, by U.S. policy, that wasn't. No, that came a year later. The first country was actually the Soviet Union.
What about Joe Biden when he said that Israel was one of our biggest investments in the Middle East?
What about it? He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, the United States helped to create Israel, so they don't just recognize it.
Well, it's definitely helping to maintain its apartheid rule for sure. But Great Britain was the country, the focal point in creating the state of Israel.
Whenever you said that the Arab Legion, like their forces were deployed outside of the Jewish controlled areas, like where were they?
Most of the fighting between the Arab Legion, which was under the thumb of Glub Pasha, and the what became the IDF, that was mostly all of it was centered around Jerusalem. So King Abdullah wanted to make sure that he was able to annex the Arab part that was under the UN partition plan, and wanted to make sure that he kept the holy places, all of it, the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Muslim quarter. So that's where all of the fighting was. Once he was able to establish that, okay, Palestine, I don't care what happens to you. Even the Egyptians asked for help from the Jordanians. Like, help us. We're getting creamed down here in the Naqab. I kind of have an agreement that I can't do that. Sorry. He didn't say it like that, but that's pretty much what happened. Can't do that.
Inshallah, something like that.
What exactly led to 1956 war?
Oh, that's a separate topic altogether. The tripartite invasion. Yeah, Suez Canal, the Suez Crisis. Yeah, that'll be another teaching. But that's more regional. Basically, the main impetus was the nationalization of the Suez Canal under Jamal Abdel Nasser, and the French didn't like it. By the way, that's when the second-tier status of Great Britain was shown. Once Eisenhower was able to convince Great Britain, hey, get out of there now. That's when Great Britain realized we're not the power anymore. It's this guy over here and this other dude over here. Soviet Union, the USSR, and these are the two players now. That's when Great Britain slowly but surely kind of just left the region. Like, okay, we're out. We're not the power players anymore. Yeah.
There was a plan like the Far East, Siberia. They created the Jewish autonomous state in 1934, right? Why this time? I don't know why this time did not.
This was in 1934. The Zionist movement, after Theodor Herzl's passing, they put aside any type of plan that was outside of Palestine. There were a lot of plans proposed: Madagascar, Argentina, Uganda, Kenya, Uganda. All these plans were put to rest once Theodor Herzl passed, and Menachem Begin was 100% focused. We have to get a country to help us support our agenda in Palestine. We couldn't get it with the Ottomans. We couldn't get it with the Germans. We got it with the British. Great.
Were these plans real, or they just like?
Oh, you weren't here for the first session, were you? Okay, so that's see, that's why you got to come to all five. But that went into the Ottoman era. Just quickly, we got a little bit of time. So the Sultan at the time, Sultan Abdul Hamid, Theodore Herzl visited, and he also sent individuals to coordinate, support a charter for Jewish colonization in Palestine, and they invoked a lot of anti-Semitic tropes. Hey, we got money. We'll help you with your debts, Ottoman Empire. I know you're struggling with debts. You just lost Egypt in 1882. You know, you're losing countries. You're going to lose the Balkans. We can help you because, you know, we're Jews. We got money. I mean, the thing that you would get banned over in the U.S. today, Zionist leadership was using. They loved it. They said, "Oh, we're going to use anti-Semitism to our advantage." That's exactly what they tried to do with Sultan Abdul Hamid. Didn't work. Did not want to sell an inch of Palestine, and so eventually the Zionist movement gave up on that. They tried to go to the German Caesar. Same thing. They were able to get something out of him, but not something concrete. Great Britain is when they were able to establish or get the Balfour Declaration, based on partially this anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power. So Balfour believed that, okay, the Jews can help the U.S. get into the war. The Jews can help the Russians. They can help us. Okay, fine, we'll give them this land. And we also don't like them. Balfour, I don't want you here in Great Britain, so go to Palestine. Perfect. It solves our Jewish problem too. And guess who said that? Theodore Herzl himself. He said, hey, Great Britain, we can solve your Jewish problem. You guys hate us? Great. Please hate us. Send us over there to Palestine. I mean, anti-Semitism was flowing through all of this, you know. And the Zionist movement, and Ilan Pape, Israeli historian, once said this: the Zionists loved to invoke anti-Semitism to achieve its Zionist gains. Look at that. That wouldn't make statement on Fox News. I mean, that wouldn't make sense to Fox people. Like, what? You mean a Zionist can be an anti-Semite? Yes. Yes, you can be a Zionist, fervent Zionist, and be a fervent anti-Semite. You could be both.
Even though the founders of Zionism were atheists, right?
We're atheist or agnostics.
I thought, weren't they also working with the Nazi Germans over there as well?
That was the Leahy. Remember we talked about the three. Remember we talked about the three different militias. Leahy under Yitzhak Rabin, they were actually funded by the Nazi regime. Yitzhak Shamir, who eventually became prime minister of Israel, and he's also known to have said, quoted to have said, Palestinians are cockroaches. And he loved symbolic language. I mean, you know the symbolism behind cockroaches, right? They're too many, and they're worthless. There's a lot of them, and there's no substance to them. We can't. They're not like bees where you can extract honey. You can't benefit from cockroaches, but there's a lot of them. So you just step on them, just push them aside. I mean, no, there's symbolism behind that. The word cockroaches didn't just come out of thin air. He knew exactly what he was saying. That we are worthless. We're the dehumanization aspect that runs through the Balfour Declaration all the way to the present. Zionist leadership love to invoke that, because they can't accomplish their gains without dehumanizing us first. It goes hand in hand.
So remember when you were talking about how the very strict
In a way, yeah.
like weren't there like any contracts signed or how did that work?
Francis Boyle, an attorney at University of Chicago, who was actually he was Yasser Arafat's attorney actually during Oslo, but he didn't he didn't use them wisely. But he said that the UN has the right to kick Israel out of the UN for not abiding by the very agreements that it said it would accept as a condition for admission into the United Nations. So he's made that point. So yeah, that's a good argument. I think.
I mean, there's a lot of
Okay.
countries, there's a lot
Any-
of countries that are coming.
Any decision that is taken, any decision that is taken by the international body, i.e. the General Assembly, for it to be law enforceable, it has to be accepted by the United Nations Security Council. And there's always that veto power.
That's gotta go.
Yeah. By the way, these ignoramus Republicans that say that we should get out of the UN, do you like smart, evil Republicans, the smart ones? You say, are you stupid? If we do that, then Israel, then it's worse for Israel. It's not better. We need the Security Council. So the dumb Republicans say that. The smart ones don't talk like that. You'll never hear like a Newt Gingrich or somebody who's has evil ideas, but he ain't no fool. He wouldn't talk like that. Yeah.
So I have heard, was Kennedy,
Oh, we're talking outside the scope of this. Okay, let's have just this discussion on Palestine. Let's go.
well, I mean, because he was one of the presidents that also was not, he was not down with what Israel was doing.
Look, when you look at things comparatively, you can make that case about a lot of presidents. I can say that Ronald Reagan was better than Obama on Israel.
On lots of stuff.
I'm talking about Reagan. Republicans love Reagan. Did you guys watch that rally, that recent rally with Trump, where he just his
In Texas?
entourage that talked about racism
Oh, yeah.
and all of that.
Real scumbag.
Rudy Giuliani or somebody talked about Reagan and praised Reagan and all this stuff, and I'm like, you know that Reagan suspended F-16 fighter jets to Israel, right? You know that Reagan allowed, I think, 12 UN resolutions condemning Israel, right? Like, it was a different time. Like Reagan would be an anti-Semite today. If Reagan was president today, he would be an anti-Semite. Based on the propaganda of today's age. All right. We're good, of course.